Hello everyone, and welcome to the Gaia, Biomes, and Spawners tutorial series. Last time, we went over texture spawning, and in this episode, we will be covering spawning game objects. However, before we get to that, I'd like to mention that Procedural Worlds has recently released a way to get our assets, along with extra content like stamp packs and ready-made levels. It's significantly cheaper than getting our assets on the asset store, so links will be in the description. Alright, to begin I'd like to talk about and demonstrate some of the most important settings in Gaia spawners. To do this I'm going to make a new spawner, call it Cube Spawner, and I'm going to add a spawn rule. It's going to be a game object spawn, and in prefabs we're going to add an instance and then drag in our prefabbed cube here. We're going to make sure that the spawn offset is 0 and that our rotation offset is 0 within the instance settings. And then we're going to set our fixed scale to 40 so that we have these really big cubes across our terrain. Okay, so now we're going to reduce the jitter to 0. We're going to make our min and max rotation 0 and 0. And we're going to set our location increment to 40. Because the cube's size is 40. Actually, let's bump that up to 45 so that we have some gaps between the cubes. So now if we turn on the visualization for the spawn rule, we can see that everywhere we should have a cube spawning. We should have really big cubes arrayed along our terrain here. So let's see if that happens. And it does. Excellent. So you can see we have all these cubes just lined up everywhere along our terrain in a perfectly grid-like structure. Now, when you start adding more masks to your spawner, you'll begin to have areas that aren't accepted in the visualization. So if we turn on visualization and we have a slope mask where it only accepts areas between 1 and 18 degrees, then we spawn, we'll get a few fewer cubes. And as you can see, those steep areas have now been excluded from our spawning. So now let's say 0 to 2 degrees. And we can see with our visualization that it makes it even more exclusive. There are only a few areas where the spawns are permitted. But you'll notice some strange things. In areas like this, you have your cube spawning in a spot where there are clearly pretty steep slopes. As you can see with the visualization, it spawned right here, but it didn't look over here to see if there was a steep slope. To fix this, you need to increase your bounds radius. The bounds radius is an area that the spawner checks and then gets the average fitness, which is a value between 0 and 1, of how fit the spot is in relation to your mask settings. So for our slope mask, you can see that these areas are between 0 and 2 degrees, the ones that are fully green. And the ones that are less green, you'll find are less suited to your masks. So they'll have a lower value, closer to 0. So if we were to increase our bounds radius to, let's say, 40, then we would see that in a lot of these cases we won't get spawns. And it's true. So we begin to look over here, we see we've become even more exclusive with our spawn rules. And we want to continue to refine it so that we get no areas like this. So in our visualization, you can still see this area is pretty spotty. Like this spot here is a big gap. And to do this, you need to increase your minimum area fitness. The minimum area fitness is the average in the bounds radius of the fitness. And it'll convert that value from 0 to 1 to a percentage out of 100. And it takes all these spots, right? So in this square, it'll look everywhere and say, all right, this is an area with 0 fitness, this is an area with 1 fitness, and it'll take the average of all those different areas, and if it's above what we have set here, then it'll spawn it. And right now our minimum area fitness is 25. Let's increase that to something really exclusive, like 90. And with 90, we might not even get any spawns on our terrain. A single spawn. So we've made our rule so exclusive that on our entire terrain there's only one location where it fits. Now, another big thing is you can see like there are obviously other spots where we would have been able to spawn. However, it didn't. This is because of the location increment. The location increment is the step rate between every time it checks. If we were to set our location increment even lower, or lower to something like 5, then we'd get more spawns on this terrain. It would check more often to see if a spot is suitable. So let's spawn that with 5. And there, now you can see only this area has above 90% fitness, but because our location increment is so small, we've gotten a few more spawns. It's identified a few more areas where it's suited. However, we have a lot of overlapping, and that's where this self-collision check bool comes in. The self-collision check bool is super useful for whenever you're spawning large game objects, or really any game object at all that you don't want to overlap with each other. So when we tick that on, we can see that we get all these extra spawns, but none of them overlap. Obviously that is super helpful, and we're going to be using that a lot throughout this episode. So, now that I have demonstrated some of the most important aspects of the spawner, we can move into base and adding those beautiful kit bash assets that you saw in the last videos. We're going to delete the spawner, remove it from our biome, and then we're going to move on to creating all of our buildings. Before we get into spawning our buildings, I'd like to talk about a general thing that you should keep in mind when designing your own biomes. All the biggest objects that you are spawning should be first, and all the smallest should be last. This ensures that there is space for the large objects instead of all the small objects clogging up the terrain and therefore preventing spawns. So, keeping this in mind, let's create a new spawner, call it Wasteland Large Buildings, and then let's create our first building spawn rule. Go into prefabs, add an instance, resource name to our LB, large building 1, and the resource name to LB1 as well. So now we want our location increment to stay at 25 for now. We're going to reduce our jitter down a little bit, and jitter really is just how close it is to being a grid placement. So reducing it down to 75 makes it a little bit less random and more grid-like. And then we are going to keep our rotation like that, and we're going to not add our mask settings underneath the spawn rule. We're going to add them in the spawn settings area up here. And the reason we're doing this is because all the buildings that we're going to have down here are essentially just going to have the same rules, and we want them all to be applied to all of them. So doing this allows us to achieve that really cleanly and neatly. So we're going to add a slope mask. We're going to turn visualization on to make sure everything we're doing is correct. So as you can see, we need to invert this. And we're going to change it to be more specific, 0 to 2 degrees. Then we're going to set our global spawn density to 1, just so that our objects have as many spawns as they can get. because we're going to be so exclusive with this. I can close that, add another mask, a collision mask this time. And the collision mask is one of the most powerful masks that you can have. What it does is all sorts of things. You can set radiuses around tags, trees, and layers. And we're going to set it up to not collide with objects that are in the small, medium, and large layers. So now that that is set up, we should be able to go back down here and drag our building into our desktop prefab location. So we're going to go into big buildings. I'm going to lock this. We're going to drag our big building in. And it's important, really important, to make sure that you set all your layers to be on the PW object large, or you're going to spend a lot of time debugging and trying to figure out why your collision layer isn't working when it's just because the object's not on the right layer. So now that those are all set to PW object large, we're going to take this spawn rule. We're going to just look at a few other things here. We're going to change our spawn offset in the Y so that it ensures that it doesn't spawn above ground a little bit, and it just sinks it into the ground to be safe. So we're going to go from -1 to -0.5. And then we don't really want any offset in the X. The rotation is fine, and our fixed scale is fine. Alright. Let's spawn that on the terrain and see how many spawns we get. And just like with the cubes, we got far too many. So what we want to do is set our minimum area fitness to be 90. Turn our self-collision check to true and set our bounce radius to 40. Now we're going to spawn local. And it looks like we've made this a bit too exclusive, so we're going to change the minimum area fitness to 80. Alright, now we've got one spawn, but I'm still not very satisfied with that. I prefer to have some more. So we're going to drop it down to 75 and see how that goes. Okay, we got a couple spawns, but I'd like even more now. So now we can start decreasing our location increment so that more checks are made across our terrain. So we're going to spawn local. Alright, and this is a pretty good number. Let's just check that we're satisfied with the places that these are being put. And yeah, I think all these places are appropriate from what I can see here. Although this one I'm not liking. Let's check the visualization and just see how it would be. Interesting. So, yeah, I don't think that should have spawned there. So let's up it back to a minimum area fitness of 80 and then spawn. Alright, nice. I think we're getting a nice balance of a little centralized area here and then some spread out there. And now that we have this one building working, we want to add more rules to our setup. So we're going to duplicate this twice. And we're also going to set the rule name to LB1, no space, LB2, but we want this to have a different prefab, so we're just going to drag in this one. and LB3. Oh, and another thing I forgot to mention, you're going to want to change your resource name there as well and here as well. So I'll do that on the second one in a moment. Here we go. So check, make this 2, make this 2. Excellent. So now when we spawn this, we have a large variety of buildings. However, we have a problem. You can see that in places like this, the buildings are not doing what we'd like them to do. They're intersecting. So to fix this, there's a really helpful thing that we can do with padding on the collision mask. And the reason we want to do this is because if you look at the visualization, when this building here tried to spawn, it checked around it and it saw that the area that's within the collision mask had a fitness that is higher, that is 0. But the average of all the area that it checked was still good enough to spawn. So what we want to do is add a padding of something like 5 to this, and that should solve our problem. And if we still have the problem, then we'll simply increase it again. So yeah, we'll increase our padding to 10 to further disperse these buildings. And there we go, problem fixed. Alright, so now that that is sorted out, we can move on to the second phase of our, the second spawner that we need to set up for our buildings. And that is going to be the medium building spawner. So to do that, we're going to go down into advanced, we're going to go to resource management, and we're going to duplicate this spawner. We're doing this because really the medium buildings are going to be the exact same, they're going to follow the exact same rules as the large, except they're just going to be different prefabs, and we might want to change the slope mask or the minimum fitness so that they can spawn in different areas. Also, of course, we're going to need to change the bounds radius because these buildings are smaller. So, we're going to first go in, change this to MB1. MB1. Going to change the name of it to Wasteland Medium. Then we're going to go into prefabs. Just to MB1. And then find our medium buildings. Make sure that they are all on the layer of pre-W object medium. And we'll go back to our wasteland medium buildings and drag this in. We're going to keep our spawn offset the same. Nothing in the instance settings has to change. We're going to change our location increment quite a bit because we're going to have a bounds radius that is less exclusive, so we're going to change this to perhaps 15 for now. Our bounds radius will be 20. And I think I am satisfied with that for now, so we'll just delete the other two and duplicate to save a bit of time. Let me just double check everything here. Maybe set this down to 75 so it's a bit less exclusive. We'll get more of them. So yeah, duplicate twice. Same thing as we did with the large buildings. Okay, now that that's done, because these buildings aren't as big as the last ones, we're going to decrease the padding around this. Okay, now that that's done, because these buildings aren't as big as the last ones, we're going to decrease the padding around this slightly. We're going to shrink it just down to something like 5. And that should ensure that we don't get any of the problems that we had with the previous buildings, but we still get a higher density. So if we spawn this, let's see how it goes. Alright, I am relatively satisfied with that. I think it makes sense the way the spawns have happened. And we're going to change the padding on the small buildings a lot so that we get a bunch in here. But I like the way we have sort of a center area and then we have sort of a disperse around our main city. Okay, so now we need to add this to the biome. So we're going to simply drag in the wasteland medium buildings and then make sure that is a child to the wasteland biome. And then we're just going to do the same thing again and duplicate. So we're going to go into Advanced, Resource Management, Duplicate Spawner. We're going to call it Wasteland Small Buildings. And then, same deal. And I'll just skip over this and stop in the locations where any special exceptions are being made. Okay, so all those buildings have been spawned on our terrain, and all I did to change between the medium buildings and the small buildings is I changed the padding here to just a simple 3 around all of our buildings. So now you can see we have some that are really close together, and it actually looks quite good the way this has all been set up. I think it turned out quite well. So next we're going to add the second layer onto our game object spawning. Right now we've established the base layer, all the buildings, all the main attractions sort of, and now we're going to add all of like the rubble surrounding the buildings that may have fallen off and things like that. All right, to start the next phase here, we're going to go to our wasteland biome, create a new spawner, and we're going to call it Concrete Crags. And we're going to create a spawn role, go to game object. We're going to name this CF1, resource name CF1. Then we're going to go down to prefabs and add an instance. But not just one instance, we're going to add 4 instances. When spawning the buildings before, we were just spawning a single game object each time the spawn rule was triggered. But you probably noticed that you can enter multiple instances of game objects for every spawn rule. By adding more than one instance to a spawn rule, you can spawn multiple different prefabs that belong together in a single spawn. This can allow you to spawn simple groups of objects, like different variations of rocks, together, but you can also set up complex buildings with street lanterns and fences where each game object is an individual instance. So we're going to be using this to allow us to spawn little groups of concrete fragments, one large one and then a few smaller ones around it. So what we're going to do here is we're going to set the first one's probability rate to 100. We'll keep that spawn offset now. We may need to reduce it later. And for this first one, things are going to be very simple. We're going to name this main instance. And then we're going to go to these second ones. And then we're going to change its spawn offset in the Z and the X to be between 1 and -1. So let's go through and do that now. We're also going to set them to have a rotation offset in the X, I believe. So we're going to set this to be between, let's say, 80 to 90. So instead of being flat, they're going to, 90 to 80. So instead of being flat, they're going to be curved upwards and look like they sort of stabbed into the ground and have stuck there. We're also going to do that for our main instance. So all right, that's looking good. Okay, so let me just double check that this was ever applied. Okay, it seems that it wasn't. There we go. So then this instance we're going to call extra frag 1. And it's also important for us to decrease the probability rate, so we get a bit of randomization with the number of fragments around the object. So once that's set up, it looks like we also should definitely decrease the size of these secondary objects that we're spawning. And that looks good. I'm just going to repeat this for the second two, and then we're going to pull in our desktop prefabs for all of them. All right, so now for these desktop prefabs, we're just going to go to concrete fragments, and we're going to drag these all in. Okay, very good. And now we can actually go into these spawn rules here. So we're going to more or less do the same thing as we always do. Tick on self collision check, set bounds radius to the correct size of the object, set our location increment to actually be quite high, I believe. And then we're going to set up our mask settings in an overarching fashion. So between 0 and 2 as per usual. And then we're going to do some pretty fancy stuff with collision masks. I'm actually even going to toggle the slope mask off because I'm not sure if we need it yet. So we're going to have everything in a radius of our small, medium, and large. We don't want it to be inside those. But then we also want it to be within a radius. We want to have a strip around all of our spawns here where they can spawn, where the fragments can spawn. So to achieve that, we've set up a collision mask where it excludes the inside of these game objects. And now we're going to make a collision mask that is inverted, and we're going to give it some padding. So you can see here we have sort of a ring around all of them. And we're going to set the padding to be fairly wide. I'm thinking 15. Yeah, I think 15 looks pretty good to me. And then we just need to sort of determine how dense we want these to be set up. So right now it's pretty dense. So I'm going to thin out the spawns, I'm going to decrease the probability rate of these spawning to something like 50, and then I think we could be in business here. If we don't get as many spawns as we want still, then I'll simply increase the location increment, or I'll decrease the probability rate. And I think we have a few more than I wanted here. Let me just come down and check though. So yeah, you can see that our instances are working exactly as we intended them to. They're all sticking out of the terrain quite nicely. I actually think this is a good number. So what we're going to do now is we're going to change the main instance. So we're going to have 3 different types where the main instance is different to add some more variability between the different fragment types. So we're going to just duplicate this twice, and I'm going to go and do that. So CF2, CF3, settings, CF2, CF3, and then it's just a matter of going in to the desktop prefab and changing this and changing this. Excellent. So in theory that should be all set up. If we get a higher spawn density than we would like, now we are going to just dial it back even more. And I actually still think that's pretty good, although actually these sort of clusters are not what I'd like them to be. So I'm going to dial the spawn probability to something like 30% or 35. Spawn probability is an excellent setting you can use to thin out spawns, especially in use cases like this. And there are a bunch of ways to thin out spawns. Like you can use the global spawn density. There are a ton of different ways. But for the purposes of this video, we're going to be using probability. I'm not liking how little the second shards are sticking out in some scenarios. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into their frags, and I'm going to change this to 0.15 and see how that works. Alright, and then I'll do these other ones sped up. Alright, that's all done. Let's spawn. And let my computer deal with a bit of lag here. And yeah, that does look a little bit better, I think. Okay. So, now, on to the next phase. We are going to create, oh, and it seems I forgot to change the name of the spawner, so we're going to call this spawner rubble, that is the next thing we're doing, the rubble. Right now, we want to change this to concrete frag. Correct. There, nice. Alright, so we're going to go to our spawn biome. And actually, the next one we're creating, which is another sort of rubble type, is very similar to this one. So we're actually going to do the same trick that we did earlier, and we're going to duplicate this spawner. And we need to unlock the inspector here. So we're going to call this, let's see here, waste and rubble. And it's going to do the exact same thing essentially of what we did before, except we're not going to have the multiple instances. So we can remove these spawn rules and add a new one. So we're going to set it to game object, do all the standard stuff. So I'm going to set it to RB for rubble. Or actually, we'll just do R for now, R1. Following these naming conventions are quite handy over the course of a project. Add a single instance, name this instance main, and then we're going to go to our rubble and call it there. That's looking good. And let me just check the scale of this rubble on our terrain and see how much bigger we maybe need to scale it up. Alright, I think perhaps a scale of 3 would do what we want. So we're going to set the scale fixed to 3. And we're going to actually randomize it here. So this is another thing that can happen. So our maximum is going to be 3. Our minimum is going to be 2. That should be good. And then all that is left is to decrease the probability rate to something like 35%, like we did with last. Keep the location increment the same. Minimum area fitness should be upped really to something like 75. Or actually, in this case, all the areas that it's going to spawn are very high fitness anyway, because it's, if you examine the visualization, you can see that all of these areas are 100% fit. It's just the way we've set it up. And then for the rest of this, I think we should be all good. Our bounds radius really should be 2, and we should have self-collision check on just to be safe. Alright. And then we're just going to do the same thing we do always, and duplicate it twice, change the names. And then change the instance type. So take this one. Take this one. And then we should be all good. And let me just double check that I didn't drag either of those in. So now when we spawn, we should get quite nice results all across our terrain. Let's see, yeah, this looks like it's one. Just these little details sticking out of our terrain every once in a while are we can generate quite a nice result. So if we can see all the areas where they have spawned. And actually it does seem like many of them are spawning under the ground. So to fix this, we're just simply going to set our spawn offset in the Y to be 0. Or maybe if the problem persists, to be positive. Okay, now that that is done, let's spawn again and see how it's looking. Okay, I'm liking that, I think. We're getting some good results of rubble fragments that have fallen out of the blast zone, or something like that. And one thing that we have to do, and even I forgot this, so it just goes to show how easy it is to forget, is we need to go to PW Object Small and make sure that this happens on all the rubble and all the concrete fragments. And it might be that we want to create an extra type for these ones, or that an extra layer for these ones because they are quite small, and we may want to exclude them from some of our other rules. So we're going to go here and sort of see what the visualization looks like with these. Sorry, spawn both of these again. But before we do that, we really should add our wasteland rubble to our biome. And there we go, it is added. So let's spawn both the concrete fragments, spawn local, and also the wasteland rubble. And there we can see it's not a very big difference, but it's a difference nonetheless to ensure we have no clipping between our game objects. The next thing I want to do is we have our building set up, we have sort of the area surrounding the buildings populated with these fragments that we've spawned, but now we're going to enhance how the buildings blend with the terrain. And to do that, we're going to utilize the relatively newly added terrain modifier stamp rule. So the terrain modifier stamps allow you to essentially use the stamper in a spawner. And this is useful in a variety of the ways. And for instance, if you were trying to make an island offshore while you're spawning, and for things like this. What we're going to do is we're going to generate a stamp around the edges of all these buildings so that we have a better blending with the terrain. And then once we've generated that, we're going to texture it so that it's the same texture as this here. And you'll see that we get a really, really good blending result. So we're going to set up our mask settings to be a collision mask. Our stamp influence will be local, will be layer game object, and it will affect all of our PW object layers. We're going to set up visualization for this just so that we know what's going on. And you can see we get these really odd, really big visualizations here. And then to fix this, we're going to go in here. We're going to change the stamp influence to global. We're going to change the absolute height to 1. And you can see now we're affecting everywhere but where we want to affect. But we're just going to take this little invert box, and there we go. You can see we're going to get some raised height around these areas with the visualization. So let's go to our bigger buildings and see how it looks over there. I think I do want it to be a little bit less, so we're going to change it to 0.5. And I think I like that quite a lot. So let's set up all our naming here. And we're going to call this Wasteland Spawner Building Raise. And actually, that's not a great name for it. We're going to call it Terrain Raise, because we're not raising our buildings, we're raising our terrain. And the name will be Raise here as well. So let's spawn this. It'll give us a warning, and I should mention that you can restore your height map data fairly easily. Gaia records samples before and after, and all you need to do is go and restore it. And there we go. You see the terrain is coming up to meet all these areas really nicely. So next we want to do the texturing. So we're going to create a new spawner and call it Building Texture Blend. And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to have a collision mask that has a layer guide object and covers all of our small, medium, and large. Let's just create a new spawn rule, terrain texture, rubble, visualize, invert, and it seems we have ignored our large and mediums. There we go. And now all that needs to be done is we need to go into our rubble textures. We need to go drag in the texture, the normal map, and the mask map. We just need to spawn. And I did drag in the wrong thing for the mask map there. My apologies. That should be quite a bit better. So yeah, now you can see the terrain blends around our objects really, really well. It's a lot more difficult to see that line. So I believe that's everything I wanted to cover in this episode. In the next one, we will be covering some of the more terrain-oriented aspects, such as the trees and some grass. I hope you all enjoyed, and I'll see you all next time.